So ever since I put out my top 15 werewolf movies video, I've been getting requests to do the same thing for vampires, and I knew I couldn't quite do that because that's my favorite horror subgenre. I had to do something extra special. So today we're kicking off a series of list videos dedicated to vampires, all leading up to one giant list video. And today we're kicking off with the greatest horror icon of all time, my favorite fictional character, the king of the vampires, the impaler, the prince of darkness, the son of the dragon, Count Dracula. So enter freely of your own will, because we're talking about my top 15 Dracula movies of all time. What's going on, my friends? Welcome again to the Cobweb channel. My name is Daniel, and I'm so excited to do this list based on this classic character created by Bram Stoker, or perhaps documented by Bram Stoker, depending on what you believe. And kicking off the list at number 15 is by far the most recent film to make the list. I saw it in theaters back in 2022, and I don't have it on physical media, but you can stream it right now on Netflix. That is The Invitation. After the death of her mother, Evie is approached by an unknown cousin who invites her to a lavish wedding in the English countryside. Soon she realizes a gothic conspiracy is afoot and must fight for survival as she encounters twisted secrets in her family's history. So this movie was not received well when it came out, but I absolutely loved it. Now, the movie plays a little bit coy with the fact that it is a Dracula movie for a long time. It treats it a little bit like a twist, but I went into it expecting it's a Dracula movie. And if you're any kind of a Dracula fan, I think you can tell very early on. I mean, they're at Carfax Abbey, for goodness sake. But this is an interesting one because it kind of merges a gothic vampire movie with a little bit of a Bridgerton, Pride and Prejudice kind of a thing, where a woman goes to this gothic castle out in England. The movie takes place in present day, but it might as well be period because everything around them is antiques, and the way they dress, it's all very old-timey. And she gets swept off her feet by this very handsome nobleman named Deville. I mean, come on. And he just might be Count Dracula. He's played by Thomas Doherty, who is good in the movie. This is definitely a very handsome and charming and alluring version of Dracula. Whether Dracula is going to be attractive or an absolute grotesque monster is going to vary greatly on this list, but this is a very particular version. And the movie reminds me a lot of the Hammer film Brides of Dracula, which is technically not a Dracula movie, and this one is, but it's got really great Brides of Dracula content to it. That's something that I love to look for in Dracula movies, because I think his brides often have the potential to be even creepier than he is, and I think that's the case with this movie. But the movie does go full-on horror by the end after being more of a romance for the first two-thirds, and you get a more grotesque version of Dracula, which I really enjoy. I think this movie is underrated, and I think if you thought it just looked like some generic modern-day horror movie, I think it's a return to classic gothic cinema, and I think you should check it out. If I'm doing a classic monsters list, I love to get some Paul Naschy in there, and this is Count Dracula's Great Love at number 14 from 1973. Four women spend the night in an old deserted sanitarium on a mountain in Romania, and they each in turn fall into the evil hands of a doctor who might be more than he seems. So I have this movie on this beautiful Vinegar Syndrome Blu-ray, and I just recently watched it for the first time and really enjoyed it. This also, like The Invitation, plays a little bit coy with the fact that the Dracula character is Dracula. You have Paul Naschy playing a scientist who is also handsome and charming, at least the movie tries to convince you that he is. And some of the women fall in love with him, fall under his spell, until it's revealed that he's Count Dracula. I mean, come on, could you guess? The plot of the movie is very strange because for a long time, it's the most typical plot you can possibly do for a gothic horror film, where people have an accident in their carriage and they're stranded, and the only place to stay is this old deserted mansion with this spooky, creepy guy who's living there. And they have to spend a week there while they wait for repairs. And that's all very typical, but that's like the first hour. And then the final third of the movie gets really strange and much more unique. Some ways in a good way, some ways in a bad way. Slight spoilers for this movie. A lot of the plot has to do with Dracula trying to resurrect his daughter. And that's a big thing that he's trying to do with these women because he needs like a sacrifice and such. And he doesn't end up resurrecting his daughter. It's very strange. While the movie is very much a monster movie for a long time, it starts to try to be more of a romance film by the end, with Dracula giving certain things up for the woman that he loves. And the way Dracula meets his demise in this movie, as you know, Dracula dies in every Dracula movie, is really unique and really interesting. Now, Paul Naschy is not a great Dracula. His look is definitely more suited to be a werewolf character than a Dracula character, and he usually was a werewolf more often, but he's kind of a sad and more humanized version of Dracula, which I did think was interesting. And on the Blu-ray, you can watch it in either an English dub or a Spanish dub. It's dubbed either way. But I have to say I recommend the Spanish dub because the voice for Dracula is much better, much more creepy. The English voice for Dracula sounds like Gregory Peck, which doesn't really work. Also, I want to keep telling you how the Vampire Brides content is in each movie, and it's fantastic in this film. Extremely creepy vampire brides. And if you like scenes of vampires biting people, this probably has more vampire bites than any other movie I've ever seen, and it's only 83 minutes long. So yeah, highly recommended. God bless Paul Naschy, or Prince of Darkness bless Paul Naschy. Paul Naschy is great. Spanish guy who made a lot of monster movies. I just love him. If you know anything about me, you know that I love Hammer films. So here is our first Hammer Dracula movie at number 13. This is Taste the Blood of Dracula from 1970. Three elderly gentlemen are searching for some immoral excitement in their lives and get in contact with one of Count Dracula's servants. In a nightly ceremony that leads to the death of this servant, they restore the Count back to life. As a revenge, the Count makes sure the gentlemen are killed one by one. Now, this is the fifth film in Hammer's long-running Dracula franchise. An interesting thing about this one is it was written to not actually have Dracula in it. Christopher Lee didn't really want to do these movies anymore, so they tried writing him out by making Ralph Bates into the new Count Dracula, at least the new vampire character of the series. And the distributor said, no, that's not going to work. We're not even going to put this movie out if Christopher Lee's not in it. So they got Christopher Lee back once again. Interesting thing about Christopher Lee, he was a great Dracula, but he didn't really love playing the character. But I love watching him, so I win at least. Now, this movie turns Dracula into a little bit of an anti-hero because these three gentlemen who he's killing one by one are absolutely horrible, horrible people. And you hate them even more because they're well-respected, rich guys in their communities who are just so much more evil than anybody really realizes. So it is satisfying to watch Dracula kill these guys, but the story doesn't really make sense because he's killing them for revenge for the death of his servant, but the death of his servant is what leads to Dracula's resurrection. So like, what's your problem, dude? Now, like most Hammer Dracula movies, it does have a charming cast of young people. These movies were a little bit of proto-slashers because they often had a bunch of teens to kind of hang out and get into shenanigans before Dracula kills them. And the lead one is played by Linda Hayden, who a lot of people will know from Blood on Satan's Claw, an amazing folk horror film. And she's also great in this movie, both as someone you want to root for and as a spooky, spooky vampire. So you get good Vampire Bride stuff in this one too because of that great Linda Hayden. At number 12 is a big old monster mashup movie, but it makes the list because unequivocally Dracula is the lead villain because Dracula's always top dog. It's Van Helsing from 2004. Famed monster slayer Gabriel Van Helsing is dispatched to Transylvania to assist with the defeating of Count Dracula. A woman that he meets there named Anna reveals that Dracula is using the secrets of Dr. Frankenstein to bring about an ancient curse involving the birth of his children. Directed by Stephen Sommers after he made the very well-received Mummy movie in 1999. A lot of people hate this movie. Some people think it's so bad that it's good. I was the perfect age when this movie came out, and I continue to really, really enjoy it to this day. I think Hugh Jackman is an incredibly cool lead action hero. He looks amazing. It's an action version of the Universal Monsters. It's period piece, and everything looks really cool in this movie, outside of some dodgy CGI, but I just think both Hugh Jackman and Kate Beckinsale look amazing, and they're super badass action heroes to fight monsters. But let's talk about Richard Roxburgh as Dracula. Now, there are several other attempts to make the Universal Monsters into action movies where Dracula is super boring, but Richard Roxburgh is anything but. He is extremely over the top, extremely theatrical, in a way that I absolutely love. Something that I really look for in Dracula performances is I want Dracula to feel otherworldly, to feel completely inhuman. Most of the time he's going to look like a human, and that's great, but the performance needs to suggest he is something completely different, something fully evil. And Richard Roxburgh pulls that off with such a theatrical, bizarre performance that I think was a reach, but I think paid off because I end up really liking him as Dracula, and I really like his plan of creating all of these bat children so that he can reproduce his line. Amazing vampire brides in this movie. They do turn into weird CGI monsters, which I'm a little bit so-so on, but otherwise they're super creepy and awesome. And the movie's got a good version of Frankenstein. It's got good werewolves. Outside of some dodgy CGI, I think this movie is really entertaining, really fun, and I still just really enjoy it. Just outside of the top 10 at number 11, we have got Dracula, Prince of Darkness from 1966. While on vacation in the Carpathian Mountains, two couples stumble across the remains of Count Dracula's castle. The Count's servant kills one of the men and suspends the corpse over the Count's ashes so the blood drips on and brings the vampire back to life. Now revived, the Count's attention focuses on the dead man's wife, who is to become his vampire partner. This is the third film in the Hammer Dracula series, but actually only the second one to feature the lead character. After his death in the first movie, this is the first resurrection in the series, and it's the best one. Absolutely awesome resurrection ritual scene. But a weird thing about it is this is actually the only one where Christopher Lee has no dialogue. Now, there are conflicting reports on why. Christopher Lee says the dialogue written was so bad he refused to say it. Writer Jimmy Sangster says, no, that's not true. I never wrote him any dialogue. You could choose what to believe. I kind of believe Jimmy Sangster because it's not like Christopher Lee refused bad dialogue in any of the other Count Dracula movies. But all that aside, this is a movie that I used to think was kind of overrated because of boring characters outside of Dracula, but I've kind of grown to love those characters, partially because I've grown to love the actors in other Hammer movies. Particularly, you gotta shout out Barbara Shelley, who's one of my favorite actors to appear in Hammer films, and she is an awesome, awesome female vampire in this movie that almost outshines Christopher Lee himself. But Christopher Lee is great in this movie, dialogue or not. He is just a snarling, monstrous beast in this movie, and I think it's awesome. I just love it. At number 10, we've got the second Universal Monsters movie to feature the character of Dracula, and that is Son of Dracula from 1943. Carpathian Count Alucard is invited to the United States. Her boyfriend and local officials are suspicious of the newcomer, who is interested in the virile new blood of this new world. So while the movie is called Son of Dracula, it's not actually Dracula's son, it's just about Dracula. He calls himself Count Alucard, but that's just Dracula spelled backwards. He turns out to be Dracula in this movie. And Lon Chaney Jr. plays him, and I'll be honest with you, Lon Chaney Jr. is not a great Dracula by any means, but he's the only thing about this movie that isn't that great. Everything else is awesome. This is actually one of my absolute favorite Universal Monsters sequels. It has a Southern Gothic atmosphere in the United States that's different from most any other Universal Monsters movie, and it's really great with fog and swamp, and it's super, super spooky, and it's got great lead character. Universal Monsters movies pretty much always have the young lovers characters, the attractive young couple who's there just to hug and embrace at the end of the movie after the monster is defeated. This is one of the only movies where the young lovers characters are great. Super, super interesting. The woman is so under Dracula's spell, and she's super into all things dark and macabre, and that's what draws her to him. It's also got Evelyn Ankers in there as the more level-headed woman who's kind of trying to figure out what's going on here with this Dracula guy. And outside of Lon Chaney Jr. being way too American to play Dracula and just not that great, everything else in this movie kind of rocks. At number 9 is a movie I watched for the first time last night, and I was so blown away by it that it already makes the top 10, and that is Blood for Dracula from 1974. Deathly ill Count Dracula and his slimy underling travel to Italy in search of a virgin's blood. They're welcomed at the crumbling estate of an aristocratic family who are desperate to marry off their daughters to rich suitors. But there, instead of the virgin women that he expected, the Count encounters quite the opposite with vile blood and Marxist manservant Mario, who is suspicious of the sickly Count. So this is directed by Paul Morrissey, and he made it right after he made his Flesh for Frankenstein movie. And it's been a while since I have watched a movie that has so blown me away with just the absolutely demented insanity of it. This movie is disgusting, disturbing. It feels like it is made by a sick, twisted psychopath. And I was just kind of amazed by that because in addition to all of the demented insanity that's going on here in like every possible way, it's extremely well made. The acting is very strange. And at first I wasn't sure if it was bad acting or not, particularly from Udo Kier as Dracula, an absolutely bizarre performance that I ended up warming up to a lot. because of how otherworldly and inhuman it is. Udo Kier seems like a creature that you want to get away from as fast as possible. A disgusting monster who mostly looks like a normal person outside of just looking a little creepy. The movie actually opens up with him putting on makeup in order to make him look a little more human and less deathly, which is a really cool way to introduce your Dracula character. And he's incredibly sickly because he hasn't been able to get virgin blood in a long time. This movie really uses vampirism as a metaphor for disease and virgin blood as an antidote that he needs. And the way Udo Kier portrays his failing body when it comes to convulsions or just blood gushing out of his mouth after he realizes it's not the pure blood he expected is so gross and weird, and the kind of things I just never expected to see an actor do in a movie. It's so bizarre. I just love it. I thought it was amazing, really demented, not for the faint of heart, but a truly great gothic Dracula movie with an amazing score and an ending that is so utterly bizarre. I was blown away that the movie went there. At number 8 is an undisputed classic and my favorite silent horror film I have ever seen. That is Nosferatu from 1922. Vampire Count Orlok is interested in a new residence and in his real estate agent's young wife. This is F.W. Murnau's unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Yes, this is a direct adaptation of the Bram Stoker novel and a far more faithful adaptation than Universal would make a few years later, but he didn't have permission to do it, and because of that, he was sued, and almost every print of this movie was destroyed under copyright infringement, and we can only watch this movie today because one film print was saved. That just blows me away. If it wasn't for that one film print existing, we wouldn't be able to watch Nosferatu. It would be lost to time, and that would just be heartbreaking because the movie is great. Unlike a lot of other silent horror films I've seen, because I'm not always the biggest fan of silent movies, it moves very quickly, very well, and Max Schreck's performance as Count Orlok, aka Dracula, is absolutely magnetic. This is before the movies figured out that Dracula was mostly going to look like a normal guy in movies, and Dracula is a grotesque, repellent monster played by Max Schreck, who is a real vampire, actually. I mean, maybe. That's what people say. Check out the movie Shadow of a Vampire, too, by the making of this movie. It's pretty cool. Yes, Max Schreck is so good and so convincing as a grotesque vampire. There are rumors that he's a real vampire, which I love. That's such a fun element of this movie. And I am so excited for the remake coming out, directed by Robert Eggers, one of the best directors working today. I think that's supposed to be coming out next year. That's going to be so good. But that upcoming movie will not be the first time Nosferatu was remade, because that's my number 7, which is Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire from 1979. Jonathan Harker, a real estate agent, goes to Transylvania to visit the mysterious Count Dracula and formalize the purchase of a property in Wismar. Once Jonathan is caught under his evil spell, Dracula travels to Wismar, where he meets the beautiful Lucy, Jonathan's wife, while a plague spreads through the town, now ruled by death. Yes, I am one of those weirdos who proudly proclaims I prefer the remake of Nosferatu to the original. I do think it's a better movie. Now, this is not a silent film, but it does utilize silence a lot in a beautiful way. The movie's absolutely gorgeous and has lots of really quiet sequences of the landscapes out in the countryside that's so beautiful, and just quiet sequences of Klaus Kinski as Dracula floating through a room in just the creepiest way. Now, if you're going to make a remake of Nosferatu and are going to replace an actual vampire in the lead villain role, I don't know, just like, depending on what you believe, you got to get Klaus Kinski, an actual psychopath. And Klaus Kinski, I think, is amazing as Dracula. He is very much a sad, pathetic, grotesque version of Dracula, much like Udo Kier's version. He is an aging aristocrat who has lived for hundreds of years in the mountains, completely separated from the modern world, separated from people, without having fresh blood in many years, and he has just become this broken down, disgusting thing that you just want to get away from as fast as possible. Like, when I watch him in this movie, I'm like, I don't even care if you're a vampire, just get away from me because of the pure social awkwardness of being near you. I also love the ending, and I do think it's better than in the silent version, both with the much deeper and more profound way that Lucy is going about trying to kill Dracula, and the final note the movie ends on, which is really bold, and I've never seen a Dracula movie end that way, and I think it's really, really cool. At number 6 is probably my favorite horror comedy ever made. That is Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein from 1948. Two hapless freight handlers find themselves encountering Dracula, the Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman. This is in the cycle of the Universal Monsters movies, and by 1948, the series was kind of on its way out, so this is a joke spoof version of the movies, but it actually brings together Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula, finally back as the character for the first time since in that original 1931 film, Glenn Strange as the Frankenstein's monster who played him a couple of times before, and Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman. And why I think this movie works so well is Abbott and Costello, classic comedy duo from this time period, are hilarious in this movie. They're so good. The comedy is top tier. They're so funny. But the monsters are taken seriously. They're taken just as seriously as in any other Universal Monsters movie, which is such a smart way to go, because while the movie's a comedy, Bela Lugosi as Dracula is awesome, absolutely the main villain of the movie, and every bit as good in this as he is in the original film. Also love Glenn Strange and Lon Chaney Jr. back as those characters as well. It's a great monster mashup movie that is hysterically funny, but has a great lead performance as Dracula in the lead villain role. Cracking into the top 5 is John Badham's Dracula from 1979. A romanticized adaptation of the Bram Stoker classic, Count Dracula is a subject of fatal attraction to more than one English maiden as he seeks an immortal bride. This is a pretty classic adaptation of the story, but one interesting thing about it is it actually kicks off with Dracula's ship landing in England. So it bypasses all the Transylvania stuff and all the ship voyage stuff and just starts with Dracula arriving in England and meeting Jonathan Harker, Lucy and Mina, and Professor Van Helsing. Here you get Frank Langella as Dracula, and this is the big exception to my thing where I said I like to see Dracula seem otherworldly and inhuman. That's not what you get in this movie. Frank Langella is a very attractive, alluring, charming version of Dracula. But it works for me in this movie because this is primarily a gothic romance film, and I think a darn good one. I think the romance that blooms between Dracula and Lucy is really interesting and cool, and in a way that you kind of feel like you're rooting for Dracula, even though he's not a good guy in this movie. He's definitely a monster, and he's definitely killing people, so the movie doesn't skimp out on that. But partially you feel like you're rooting for Dracula because the heroes, Harker and Van Helsing, are not likable, kind of boring drips, and you're not rooting for them, which makes you feel weird watching the movie. But by the end, I think those ideas come together in a way that's actually really interesting and satisfying. And I love this Scream Factory Blu-ray. If you slip off the slipcover, you see the classic poster art. And for a long time on physical media, the only version of this movie was a director's cut with desaturated color, but this brings back the theatrical edition that's a bright, beautiful color movie, and that's definitely the one that I personally recommend. At number 4 is the immortal classic Dracula from 1931, starring Bela Lugosi. A powerful and ruthless vampire named Dracula arrives in London to prey on young socialite women. Standing in the vampire's way is a group of concerned men, including Professor Van Helsing and Jonathan Harker. This is the beginning of the classic sound era Universal Monsters films, and it's one of the most important films ever made to me. This is like the first movie I can ever remember being obsessed with. I loved this when I was a kid. I loved watching it on VHS over and over again. And this movie is the reason that I was Dracula for the majority of Halloweens of my life. He's been my favorite character ever since I watched this film. Bela Lugosi as Dracula is possibly the most iconic performance ever given. I would say at least it is the most iconic performance in the history of the horror genre. If you have any general pop culture knowledge of Dracula, it's Bela Lugosi you're thinking of. He created pretty much everything we think of about the stereotypical version of Dracula, possibly even more than Bram Stoker himself did when it comes to the voice and the look. Now, Bela Lugosi actually played him on stage before he got to play him in here. Lon Chaney Sr. was going to play Dracula first, and I'm so glad that didn't work out. And what I think contributes to Bela Lugosi feeling very otherworldly in this is he didn't actually speak English very well, so he didn't always know what he was saying. And that contributes to the pure foreignness and strangeness of his performance that I think is perfect. The movie does suffer when it comes to feeling very stagey, and having boring lead characters when it comes to Van Helsing and Harker. I don't really like their characters in this movie either, but Dracula is so awesome, and I really like the performance from Helen Chandler as Mina as well, who also has that ethereal quality. And the atmosphere, particularly in the beginning in Transylvania, is probably the greatest atmosphere any gothic horror film has ever had. At number 3 is a movie that most people would not put up so high, and I fully acknowledge this is a personal favorite, a movie that is so special to me. It gives me all the warm, fuzzy feelings. That is Dracula Has Risen from the Grave from 1968. In the shadow of Castle Dracula, the Prince of Darkness is revived by blood trickling from the head wound of a priest attempting an exorcism. And once more, fear and terror strikes Transylvania as the undead vampire stalks the village of Carlsberg to ensnare victims and satisfy his evil thirst. The 4th film in the Hammer Dracula series, and one that I just love with all my heart. Now, this is not an adaptation of the classic story, it's an original story. And one thing that separates this from a lot of other Dracula movies is I love the protagonist in this movie. You've got this collection of young people, including being played by Barry Andrews and Veronica Carlson, a couple of people I love to see in old gothic horror films, who are incredibly likable. And the movie feels a little bit like a slasher movie in terms of just watching young people hang out, have fun, have little romances, and then they get picked off one by one by a monster, in this case, Dracula. Hammer regular Michael Ripper is in this as a bakery and bar owner, probably my favorite performance from him in a Hammer movie. And Christopher Lee is in top form in this movie. So commanding and scary. It might be his best performance in any of these movies, actually. I think he's so awesome, despite the fact that, again, he didn't want to make this movie. It's directed by Freddie Francis, who is an incredibly successful cinematographer, and I think that leads to this movie looking really beautiful with some incredible lighting that most of these classic Dracula movies didn't have quite so good. But at number 2 is the film that started it all for the Hammer Dracula series, and that is Horror of Dracula, or just Dracula if you're in the UK, from 1958. After Jonathan Harker attacks Dracula at his castle, the vampire travels to a nearby city where he preys on the man's family and his fiancée. The only one who may be able to protect them is Dr. Van Helsing, Harker's friend and fellow student of vampires, who is determined to destroy Dracula, whatever the cost. Made just the year after Hammer made Curse of Frankenstein, this film reunites Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, and it might just be the greatest roles that they ever played. Christopher Lee is amazing as Dracula, but actually doesn't have very much screen time in this movie, but you don't really care because Peter Cushing as Van Helsing is so awesome. My favorite vampire hunter to ever be in any movie. He is just such an awesome protagonist. Definitely my favorite protagonist in any Dracula movie is Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. Oh my God, he's so awesome. Now, the movie is not a very faithful adaptation of the Bram Stoker novel. It takes a lot of liberties, but I do respect this movie because it finds a way to tell a very big story very succinct in 90 minutes in a way where it never feels like it's rushing through anything. I think it's actually very well written in the way they contain everything in such a well-paced way. The movie moves very, very well and has an incredible finale, almost like an action finale between Dracula and Van Helsing. Oh my God, it's the best showdown between those two characters ever, and has, man, just such an amazing Dracula death. Because like I said, Dracula dies in every Dracula movie. This is one of the absolute best versions of that. It might actually be the very best. At number 1 is, I think, one of the greatest movies ever made. And I think it's very fitting that it be one, because I think it's the most faithful adaptation of the novel that any movie ever was. And that is Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. When Dracula leaves the captive Jonathan Harker and Transylvania for London in search of Mina Harker, the reincarnation of Dracula's long-dead wife, obsessed vampire hunter Dr. Van Helsing sets out to end his reign of terror. This is a movie that I actually avoided for many years because I kind of thought it was just like the watered-down Oscar bait version of Dracula. I guess I assumed that because of the director and the actors involved. And when I watched it, I found out that could not be further from the truth. This is such a crazy all-out horror movie with incredible creature effects, incredible gothic atmosphere like almost never done in any movie ever. Coppola wanted this movie to be extremely practical, so he never did, him and his son, who actually worked on the effects, never did any effects that couldn't have been done in 1931 for the original. Everything was very in camera, and the movie ends up looking jaw-droppingly amazing from start to finish. I just love the look, I love the monsters. Dracula takes a lot of different forms in this movie, which I love when that happens, because according to the novel, Dracula can be a bat, he can be a wolf, he can be mist, he can be so many different things, and this gives Dracula a lot of different horrifying looking forms. But we got to talk about Gary Oldman as Dracula. Oh my God, amazing. Now, Dracula's already had so many incredibly iconic performances before this. Lugosi, Lee, Shrek. And here, Gary Oldman makes the character so his own. A character with such intense, unbridled passion. The intensity of this character is so incredible. And he, again, even Gary Oldman has many different forms when it comes to the old decrepit version at the beginning, the handsome version towards the end that romances Winona Ryder as Mina, and this movie becomes a gothic romance. And it has an amazing cast because I love Gary Oldman so much. I love Anthony Hopkins as Van Helsing so much. Easily my second favorite Van Helsing behind Peter Cushing. Now, I know Keanu Reeves as Jonathan Harker, not great, but at this point, I've seen the movie so many times and I love it so much. It's just kind of become one of the weird eccentricities of the movie that just kind of endears me to it a little bit more. Plus, Jonathan Harker is usually always kind of a dopey character, almost never that great in any movie. I would say the Harker in Horror of Dracula is the best Harker ever, and he's not even faithful to the real character at all. So this is just another dopey Harker, and what are you gonna do? So that's it, folks, my top 15 Dracula movies of all time. Let me know down in the comments below, what are some of your favorite Dracula movies? Do you have any favorites that weren't on my list? Because I know there's some others that people love that I don't love quite so much. These are definitely my favorites. Dust off the like button if you enjoy this, and subscribe for more videos like this, because I will have several more vampire list videos coming on the way over the coming months, all leading to one giant epic vampire list video that I'm so excited for. Thank you so much for watching. With all that said, don't forget to enjoy yourself today, have some fun, stake some vampires if you get the chance, and I'll see you next time.